So good morning in Europe, good afternoon in China and Asia. Welcome to our last webinar of this year's Staying in Dialogue with China webinar series. It's the 6th one of this series, and it's the 13th webinar discussion overall. My name is Markus Herrmann. I'm a foundation board member of the Stein am Rhein Symposium STARS, and I'm the co-founder and managing director of China Macro Group. Today, Tony, the regular host of this webinar series, is unfortunately has a scheduling conflict and apologizes for his absence. And I'm conducting this webinar from Singapore today on the way to China, but we have very good connection and I'm happy about that. I would like to already now thank His Excellency Ambassador Fu Cong, based in Brussels, for his time. I'll introduce him in a few seconds. On the attendees that we have online today, we have about 25% of people dialing in from China, 10% in the Asia Pacific, and then 65% based in Europe. I would like to also thank our media and chamber partners for co-organizing this webinar series. These are Caixin Global, Swiss Champs 3 chapters in China, Beijing, Shanghai, Chongqing, and then the CIBS, the Swiss Chinese Chamber of Commerce, the Danish China Business Forum, and the European Chamber of Commerce in China. In terms of logistics of the discussion that we're having, we have 45 minutes, maybe 5 minutes more, but that's the maximum. And then I will ask questions along 4 categories. Starting with EU-China political relations, and then moving to business and trade relations, and then general foreign policy, and then closing with some more personal questions. You can type your questions if you have any into the Q&A box, and I will weave them in if they suited and where they're suited. To introduce Ambassador Fu Cong, he is the head of the PRC delegation to the European Union, based in Brussels, as I was mentioning, since December 2022, so for 7 months so far. But even though 7 months seem short, he's definitely not a stranger to Europe, because before he was a permanent representative to the Conference on Disarmament at the UN office in Geneva since February 2015. And then he was also appointed the DG, the Director General of the Department of Arms Control at the Chinese MFA in Beijing. Ambassador Fu Cong holds a degree in law. Ambassador Fu Cong, I would like to thank you for your time. I'll directly kick off with the first question and then hand over to you. So the first starter question I have is, what are the aspects of polity or institutional design of the European Union that you find interesting or confusing that you have to explain when you're briefing Beijing on European matters?
First, thank you, Markus, for having me on the program, and it's a pleasure to attend this webinar. And good morning from Brussels to all the audience. And on this question, I have to say that since I've come here, I've been trying my best to learn about the EU institutions, and I have to admit that it is quite a big institution, and it is quite confusing and very complex, and especially between the relationship between the different institutions of the EU. But what is most confusing for me is the relationship between the member states and the EU Commission and the European Commission. And because I'm a diplomat, I've been dealing with multilateral institutions in my career, and I have the feeling that for all international organizations, member states should be the driving force. But here in EU, sometimes I thought that should be the case, but in some specific cases, it doesn't seem to be like that. And in certain cases, especially in areas involving foreign policy and national security, and according to my understanding of the EU Constitution, it should be the privilege of the member states. But what we hear here now is that the EU Commission, the European Commission, is having a stronger voice, and actually sometimes it seems that the Commission is ordering the member states to do things that the member states may not agree to. So that is the most confusing part of the EU, as far as I'm concerned.
So you've described the complexity around the horizontal and vertical division of roles and describing with the member states. Let's talk about the EU as a political actor. China has, and that's maybe not known to everybody, China has published 3 consecutive white papers on the European Union and what its policy is towards the European Union since 2003. How important is the EU for China from a strategic perspective? And how do you see the EU as an actor in international politics?
Actually, our position on EU has been quite consistent over the years. We see EU as a major player on the international stage, both politically and economically. And we see EU as a partner rather than a rival, as some people wanted make it to be. And for us, we see that there are a lot of common grounds between China and EU, and there are many things that China and EU can join hands in tackling, especially when it comes to global challenges like the climate change. And also, actually, in my view, nowadays, the artificial intelligence is an area that has attracted a lot of interest and attention. I think in that area, China and the EU can have a lot to share and a lot to discuss. And also in my former area, which is the non-proliferation, we have always been saying that China and the EU share a lot of interest and common grounds. And so that's how we see EU, and we will. We do hope that despite some of the difficulties and challenges we are faced with, we still believe that China and the EU have a lot to do for the world and for ourselves.
One follow-up question, Ambassador Fu, because you say that the Chinese policy has been consistent over this time. Do you think the perception of the EU as a political actor in international politics has changed across these white papers and over time?
Well, actually, because the issues change, so it is natural that some of the positions of countries can also evolve. But we do hope that. But as I said, there is a lot of common interest that actually underline our mutual relationship. So there is all the reason that we should strengthen our cooperation and try to overcome any problems or challenges that may appear. And so that we, as I said, this is in the interest of not only for ourselves, but also for the whole world.
If we talk about how EU-China relations are structured, there used to be a so-called EU-China 2020 strategic agenda for cooperation. So a mutually agreed cooperation framework from November 2013. But right now, or there has not been an extension to this agenda. What in your mind is right now the framework that is helping to structure EU-China relations?
Yes, indeed, we have that important document, but unfortunately it has not been renewed. And but still we, as China and EU, maintain mature relationship. And we, in terms of institutional framework, we have a huge number of dialogue mechanisms, starting from the summit between the leaders of the two sides. And also we have what we call the 5 high-level dialogue mechanism, including on the security and foreign policy, including the economic and trade, digital and climate change, and also the human-to-human dialogue. So and below that, actually at the working level, we have over 70 dialogue mechanisms. So all these dialogue mechanisms provides the institutional framework for the development of our relations. In terms of the political principles, I think that indeed for any bilateral relationship to develop and flourish, there has to be some guiding principles. And in our view, we do need to have guiding principles in our relations. For instance, the non-interference in the internal affairs of countries of each other, and also the respect and the mutual respect for the core interest of each other. So these may constitute the legal and the political framework for the bilateral relations. But as I said, I'm quite confident that this relationship has a bright future, and we have great hope and expectations on our relationship with EU.
Thank you, Ambassador Fu. If I pick up one important term, multipolarity, which is being used by senior EU politicians like Josep Borrell or the EU Commission President von der Leyen, my question to you is, does it matter that EU leaders use the concept of multipolarity while the US, for instance, in its national security strategy from October 2022, they use the international rules-based order as a conceptual framework, and they basically frame Russia and China as illiberal threats to that international rules-based order? What is that difference that you feel when you're in Brussels?
Actually, when I said that we have a lot of common grounds on international issues, actually multilateralism is definitely one of them. Actually, both China and the EU advocate multilateralism, and we want to see a multipolar world, if you like. And we also believe that the current international, the global governance could be improved, and for the benefits of the whole world. So these are the common themes that both China and the EU are advocating on the international arena. And when it comes to the US terminology, when they use the rule-based international law, I think that there needs to be some clarification in this. And by the rule-based international law, if they mean that the rules should be the international law, should be the UN Charter, of course there should be no problem, because China is actually one of the most prominent features of the Chinese foreign policy is the respect for international law. And actually, if you look at the international treaties, China actually exceeded more treaties than the United States. And especially in my area, for instance, in the arms control area, and China has exceeded more treaties than the United States, and China has never withdrawn from any international arms control treaty, unlike the United States. And if they are talking about the UN Charter, definitely we have no problem with that. But we do have a problem when they talk about the rules that are concocted by a small group of countries, and especially with the explicit purpose of excluding some countries, including China. So that, of course, China is not in favor of. And and I also want to make another point. And people have been saying that China is a revisionist state, and I will refute that, because China is, for us, as far as we see, we are the beneficiary of the existing international order, and we are one of the five permanent members of the five members of the permanent members of the Security Council, and also China is one of the five recognized nuclear weapon states. And China has profited hugely from our accession to WTO. So why should China disrupt the existing international order? So there is a lot of disinformation about the Chinese position on that. And so that is another point I want to make in connection with the question you made.
Thank you, Ambassador Fu. Thank you also for sharing the examples in your specific area of past experience on disarmament for international law. If you now switch to this topic, then I would like to quote, and maybe you are already referring to that, but I would like to quote what Ursula von der Leyen said, I think end of March in her speech on the EU's China policy. She said the Chinese Communist Party's clear goal is a systemic change of the international order with China at its center. And you basically just refuted the term revisionism or revisionist because you think China is a beneficiary. Can you explain or comment on this specific sentence that Ursula von der Leyen made in her China speech?
Actually, I don't think that is a correct characterization of the Chinese foreign policy. And China, as I said, China has always stood by the international law, especially at the of the UN Charter. And if we talk about the center of the international system, we have always said that the UN, the United Nations, should be at the center of the international order and the system. So China has never wanted to put China at the center of the international order. That is a total distortion of China's foreign policy. But as a matter of fact, in this connection, I also want to mention the three great initiatives that China has put forward. One is the Global Economic, Global Development Initiative. One is the Global Security Initiative. And the latest one is the Global Civilization Initiative. So actually, if you look at these three initiatives, for the development initiative, actually it is very much in line with SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. So, and when it comes to the security initiative, if you read the document, it says upfront that we want to safeguard the UN Charter, and all the principles contained in the UN Charter need to be upheld. And when it comes to the civilization initiative, we talk about the interaction and the mutual engagement among the civilizations in order to dispel the intolerance and so on and so forth. So all this actually has one basic theme, that is putting the United Nations at the center of the international order. So I don't think that anybody can accuse China of trying to put China at the center of any international order or anything like that. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Ambassador Fu. If you just go back and just stay on the point that you have been making on the GCI, if I may, GDI and the GSI, because you're making the point and saying that it is actually within the UN order and it's strengthening the UN order. Can you maybe give some examples why you think this is, or in which regard it is trying to strengthen or deepen or improve the UN-centered system?
I think that is quite clear. Let's take the development initiative, for instance. Our objective is to connect our Chinese assistance programs with the SDG, and which actually is a UN program, and with the purpose of helping the developing countries to eradicate poverty and to improve the infrastructure and also the livelihood of the people. There are several objectives within that SDG program. So China is fully aligned with that, and the Chinese assistance program is actually in a very good position to connect with it is part of the global SDG program. So this is quite evident. And when it comes to the security, if you look at the background paper that China has tabled, we talk about upholding all the international law, including the territorial integrity and sovereignty of all countries and the non-interference, and also in internal affairs, and also the upholding the existing international treaty mechanism. And also when it comes to the security, we talk about the fact that no country can obtain absolute security at the expense of other countries' security. And all these principles are universally accepted principles of the whole world. So all these are very much in line with the UN. Actually, I want to draw attention to the latest remark by Secretary General Guterres criticizing the World Bank and IMF. they should be more, how to say, they should do more in providing the assistance to the developing countries. There was an example of during the pandemic, more loans were provided to the developed countries than to the developing countries. So these are the things that I think China would be happy to work with the international community to improve the international governance structure. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is a source that we can definitely then also want to look up. I think now we have discussed some of the conceptual discussion points, multipolarity, systemic change. I would like to switch to something very tangible, although you were not there yet. So last year, the EU-China summit was held virtually because of the pandemic context. And it was actually described by the EU side as taking place between death. And this year, the expectation is to see an in-person meeting at some point in Beijing after the council meeting. Could you give us a preview of this EU-China summit?
And actually, let me first say that this summit mechanism is an important mechanism between China and the EU. So far, we have held 23 summits, and it's held annually. And this is very important in the sense that the leaders can provide strategic guidance for the development of this very important bilateral relationship. And of course, when it comes to dialogue and consultation, sometimes we see eye to eye with each other, and on some other issues, we may not see eye to eye with each other. I think that is only natural. So, and this is how we see the dialogue. And when it comes to this year's summit, we are working with our EU colleagues and in preparing for the summit. And we are actually, just now I mentioned those high-level dialogues. All these dialogues are meant to prepare for the summit, in the sense that we'll try to try to see what we can achieve, or what we call the deliverables for the summit. And so the work is ongoing. We are going to see several senior officials from the EU visiting China. For instance, Mr. Borrell, who is the foreign policy high representative for common defense and foreign policy, and also the Mr. Dombrovskis, who is the vice president of the European Commission, and also the Mr. Mr. Timmermans is actually also visiting China very soon on climate change issues. So the mechanisms and the dialogues are ongoing, and we do hope that we can finalize the date for the summit very soon, and also do have the possibility to present to the world some of the concrete results that derive from this relationship.
So we will be all watching. It's going to be time frame July, I presume. If I want to talk, I would like to talk now a little bit about the triangle EU, US, and China. The EU is striving for strategic autonomy, but is still dependent on the US when it comes to security. But the EU and the US seem to get more aligned in their China policies. Just a couple of examples, like the triptych, so the compete, partner, and rival. Also the term or the concept of de-risking, and the cooperation in the TTC, Trade Technology Council, and also the G7 cooperation. How do you perceive the US as a factor in the EU-China relations?
Let me first say that we support the strategic autonomy of the EU. I think China is the only big country that has come out in clear support of this strategy. And we do hope that this strategy should not only remain in words, it should also remain in deeds. It needs to be implemented and need to be reflected in the foreign policies of the EU countries. And we are, with respect to the influence of the US, and I do realize that U.S. is a major external, if you like, external influence on the Sino-European relationship. And let me put it this way. Some of the European countries would not have taken the position or policies they have taken now vis-a-vis China had there not been influence, or put it more bluntly, pressure from the United States, like in the case of Huawei, in the case of the semiconductors. And so our view towards our relationship with the EU is that our relationship is not targeted at any third country, and it should not be controlled or subjugated by any third country. And so that is how we view this relationship. And we have no quarrel with the EU if they want to develop relations with the United States. But we do want to flag the point that when they develop their relationship with the United States, it doesn't have to be at the expense of China's interest. So that's our basic position. When it comes to the de-risking, let me say that well, I have to acknowledge that it is better than decoupling. It's good that the Western countries, the leaders in particular, realize that it is neither desirable nor feasible to decouple from China. So that's why they have come up with a new catchword, which is the de-risking. But we do not want to see de-risking becoming decoupling just in another name. And we do believe that we should not exaggerate the risks. And actually, when we in the case of China-EU relations, they always talk about the dependencies on China when they talk about their de-risking strategy. But as a matter of fact, according to the EU's own report, there is only a little over, or even less than 1% of the total import from China that they can call a heavy dependence on China. So we need to put this whole issue in a proper perspective. And we do not want to see, as I said, we do not want to see this de-risking evolving into a decoupling policy just in a different name. Because we are quite concerned about some of the recent development, especially the most recent one. The most recent one is this new report by the EU Commission about this Huawei and the ZTE. Actually, this is actually a very unfortunate development. And I have to say that it flies in the face of almost everything that the EU claims it stands for. For instance, the rule of law, the open trade, free market, transparency, and you name it. All these principles have been violated by the way that the EU Commission has handled this Huawei, the new report, which actually designated Huawei and ZTE as a high-risk vendor without any legal basis and without a proper procedure. So I will leave it at that, but I just want to say that we are watching the development very closely, and we don't want to see the negative impact of these things having on our relationship.
Thank you, Ambassador Fu. I would like to come back to the de-risking again, but maybe two more questions as we speak on the political side still. There's one, I'm getting several questions from online attendees, but it's actually not your formal area of your responsibility. I'm getting questions about Germany and Germany's upcoming China strategy, because Premier Li Qiang, he's in Berlin today. So maybe I'll still put the question. You can see how you can or you want to speak to it. How do you look at Germany's development and the upcoming China strategy from an EU perspective that you are focused on?
Actually, in terms of the terminology, they are more in line with the EU strategy on China. They also use what they call the triptych, the partner, a competitor, and systemic rival. And so that's how they describe this relationship. And but China, the relationship between China and Germany are important, and we are glad that this relationship is developing despite the obstacles. And now the Premier Li Qiang is now in Germany, and I'm sure this visit will give an additional boost to our relationship. So I'm quite confident of that. And I also want to emphasize that Germany, being an important power within the EU and influential power, and I'm sure they will safeguard and maintain their own interest within the framework of the EU. That's an area I mentioned in answering your first question. That is, when it comes to the relationship between member states and the EU, there are areas that member states should stick their ground, and should not allow the policies which have a direct impact on their foreign policy, on their national security, on their fundamental economic interest to be controlled or to be manipulated, if you like, by other institutions. Let me put it that way.
You make strong points about the EU in connection with the Huawei equipment that you already referred to. You talked about the rule of law, open trade, transparency. So if I basically stay on this pessimistic side of the the dynamics of the relationship, there's a rising voice in Europe that China should be viewed more as a systemic rival and economic competitor rather than just as a trade partner. So when it comes to the future of EU-China relations, do we need something like a floor or a guardrail to keep us from veering into greater geopolitical confrontation or conflict? And what would be developments that would seriously worry you? Maybe you have already mentioned some of those that seriously worry you.
Indeed, just now you mentioned this triptych. For us, as I said, we do not see ourselves as a systemic rival of Europe. Actually, partners, of course, definitely we are. Competitors, okay, because it is only natural when it comes to economics. So a benign competition is important for the development of economy. So we have no problem with that. But to call us as a rival, I don't think is a bit far-fetched. And the sad thing is that it seems that some people are moving more and more in that direction. I don't think it is in accordance, in keeping with the basic facts. Why should China and the EU become rivals? We are so far apart geographically and economically, so there is no fundamental conflict of interest between us. And also economically, we are actually complementary to each other. So we can compete, we can cooperate, but there is no reason that we should become rivals. That's how we see this relationship. So one of the things that I'm quite concerned about here in Europe, in Brussels, is that some politicians want to politicize this relationship, and especially to put ideology above everything else. And I don't think that is fair, And I don't think that is warranted. It is not in the interest of any side. And so when you come to the whether this relationship should have a flaw, indeed, we do believe that there is a need for some bottom lines, I would put it that way. For us, the Taiwan issue is the red line of the red lines. So, but now recently we see that a small number of politicians and the bureaucrats within the EU institutions, they are trying to provoke China on the issue of Taiwan, and I don't think that is responsible. They have been saying that they want to keep the status quo, but then at the same time they keep pushing the envelope. As I said, they keep provoking China, and that is not the way to maintain the status quo. So that's why I said that you need to be careful, and your irresponsible actions can only aggravate the tension. So they are playing with fire. I've said this once, and I want to say this again. So they need to be careful, and frankly speaking, it does not in line with their proclaimed interest in keeping the status quo, because they are themselves escalating the tension there. And also there are other bottom lines. For instance, I mentioned previously, there is a need to respect the internal affairs of other countries, non-interference, so actually China and the Western countries, since day one when we developed our relationship several decades ago, no country should expect to change the social system of each other, or the social system of China. And if that was a given when the bilateral relationship was started, so we don't see why they want to see us as a rival. We are not going to. We do not want to change the social system of Europe or European countries, and we respect the free choice of the people, and so they should do the same. And as President Xi said just yesterday to Secretary Blinken, that we should respect each other, and that includes the respect for the social systems of each other. So if you talk about the flaw, these are the flaws. Of course, there are also other things that are important for the healthy development of relations, because, for instance, the respect for international law. When it comes to trade, the respect for the rules of WTO, right? And so these will provide a basis for the development of relations. And if we can really keep these bottom lines, if you like, and the relationship will not veer too much off the road.
Thanks a lot. So you have been already listing multiple concerns. I was asking what would seriously worry you. If I can pull up one point that you made, just pull it up again. You said that one of the dynamics that concerns you or worries you is the politicization by European politicians. And then you said it's driven by ideology. Earlier we talked about the systemic change, and now you made the example of social system, that basically whether there's an influence across social system. Can you characterize what is this ideology that you think on the European side is creating, in your perspective, creating all these concerns?
Yes, actually, because if you analyze the situation objectively, for instance, when we talk about the mutual interest, it is so evident that it is good that the two sides should develop a robust economic relationship, for instance. And actually, that is the core of the business community on both sides. Since I've arrived here, I've been reaching out to many people, and I've talked to many business leaders here in Brussels, and they are very concerned about the political atmosphere that is prevalent today. And they all express the desire to develop the economic, to develop relations with China, to increase investment. And actually, this is only common sense that the China with such a huge market, and how can Europe develop economically without profiting from the Chinese market? I think this is only common sense. But actually, if you look at the policies or the remarks of some of the politicians and some of the regulations, legislation that are being considered, you would understand that there are people who do not want to see this development of this sound economic relationship. Why? They always talk about China being a systemic rival, China being a communist party, and so on and so forth. So that's why they put everything, or they put the ideological consideration on everything else. And that actually is harming the relationship to the detriment of their own interest. That is the, and when it comes to the political issues, as I said, China says many things. There are so many things that China can work together. But if you keep harming China's interest, keep challenging China's the social systems, political systems, how can you expect China to cooperate with you if your ultimate purpose is to challenge China's political system? I think that is only, as a diplomat, I see this as common sense. But unfortunately, people here, some people here refuse to recognize this. And as I said, out of ideological considerations.
Ambassador Fu, my suggestion, so thank you for all the explanations. My suggestion is we have about 10 minutes left. I'm also looking at some questions that I'm receiving. My suggestion would be I'll raise another 3 questions and then 2 closing questions. So we have 5 questions for 10 minutes. If that's broadly fine, we can try. Maybe the first one that I would like to raise is going back to de-risking. We both know, maybe we all know, the EU is publishing its economic security strategy today, maybe later today, or very soon. Does China feel concerned about this strategy? And does it matter that China's policy since April 2020 through the CCP's Commission on Economy and Finance itself puts emphasis on supply and industrial chain stability and security? How do you comment this point?
Yeah, actually, let me say this. First, we understand the desire of EU and the European countries for a resilient supply chain and industrial capability. And secondly, when it comes to the economic security, as I said, we should not overblow this concept, and we should put it into a proper perspective. And it should not be exaggerated to the extent that it becomes obstacle to free and open trade. And third point I want to make is that we should not conflate economic security with national security, because as I understand the constitution of the EU, national security resides within the exclusive privilege of member states. For the EU to talk about national security, I don't think that is even appropriate. So economic security should not be conflated with national security. And but unfortunately, as I said, as I mentioned previously, we do have a foretaste of what this economic security might entail by the example of Huawei. A few days before the adoption or the announcement of this economic security doctrine, and they put forward this report on Huawei and ZTE, and also in the name of national security, in the name of de-risking. And as I always say, that we have been asking the EU to clarify what they mean by de-risking. If this is what they mean by de-risking, I think that is really very concerning. And it is not appropriate, because this basically driving the Chinese companies out of the European market. And it's not going to go down well with China, with Chinese companies. And I would like to say that with the rest of the world, because now the credibility of the EU policies, and also the predictability of the EU as a single market is also on the line here. And that's why I said this issue actually flies in the face of everything that EU claims they stand for. And you also asked about China's policy. Indeed, we talk about this, what we call the dual circulation. But I want to draw your attention to what the President Xi said recently. He said the reason why we emphasize the building of our own capability is not to close our doors. And that's because we are doing this because somebody wants to want to cut China off the global supply chain. I think everybody knows that what the US is doing concerning the semiconductors. What do you expect China to do if they cut China out of the supply chain? And China, of course, will have to rely on itself to develop its own capabilities. But at the same time, what President Xi went on to say was very important, that we will not close our doors, and our doors will remain open to all those who actually want to trade with us and who want to work with us. Actually, I also want to take this Huawei example again. In the case of Huawei, Huawei is excluded from all the core networks, 5G core networks in Europe. But in the case of the European IT companies, Ericsson, and also the Nokia, there is no such exclusion. So that shows that indeed China emphasizes the importance of building up its own self-resilience, but we do not take the same measures that the EU is exhorting its member states to take, and that is to drive Chinese companies out of the European market. China is not doing that. In the case of IT industry, it is not doing this. And that is a Chinese policy in the face of what the US and some of the European countries have been doing to our companies like Huawei and ZTE. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Fu. Maybe a last very brief content question, and then I would like to go to the closing part. We've discussed broadly about EU-China relations, and we know that the council meetings are coming up by the end of the month. We know the formal policy is encapsulated in the Strategic Outlook 2019. Maybe just to help summarize for all the audience, do you think some of the policy will change in the coming weeks?
You mean the EU policy towards China? Well, actually, that's for the member states to decide, and we are following this with interest. And let me say this: and the Sino-EU relations has been developing since the end of last year, and there is a very good momentum with so many European leaders visiting China, starting from Chancellor Scholz in November last year, and then President Michel and President Macron and President von der Leyen and the Prime Minister of Spain and some other national leaders, and also on the Chinese side, we also have had several high-level delegations to EU, and of course the highest one so far is Premier Li Qiang's visit to Germany and to France. So this actually is building up this momentum for this relationship, and I'm quite confident that all these will provide more impetus to make our relationship more robust. And also, as just now I mentioned that since I came here, I've been reaching out to people. I do feel that there is such a wealth of goodwill towards China, and there's strong desire to develop relations in all fields with China. So I'm very confident about the prospect or the future of this relationship. And at the same time, we do realize that there are some challenges and there are noises that from a small number of politicians, for whatever reason, some may even be personal, and they are trying their best to hinder this relationship. And but I'm sure common sense and the common interest will prevail at the end of the day. So this is how I see this relationship. And I do hope, once again, that when it comes to foreign policy, member states need to stand their grounds, if you like. And they are the one to say where the national interest lies. And they are the one to say where the national security lies. And they should not be left to some bureaucrats which do not have any direct interest in this. And so this is how we see this relationship, and this is how we hope that EU can stand on the side of the common sense and common interest, so that our relationship can prosper.
You've been very clear, Ambassador Fu. Let me change just tack with a final, more personal question. What do you like, or what have you been liking most about Europe, or about being posted in Europe and your job here?
Yes, I like Europe. Yes, because actually in my whole diplomatic career, all my postings have been in Europe, and so I am a great admirer of the European culture and the European civilization, and I like to study European history. And so actually, I think that it's very important, especially for a diplomat, to study history. And I fully believe, I'm a full believer, strong believer of this famous quotation, that is, those who do not remember or learn from history are condemned to repeat it. We are now at a very crucial stage, at a critical juncture in Europe and in the world, that there are many things, there are many historical lessons that we need to learn. And so that's also one of the reasons I like Belgium, because there are so many historical sites in Belgium. So I've been using the weekend visiting all the small cities and towns. The cities and towns may not be big, but they are full of history. And so I've been visiting all these. So I like Belgium very much. And as far as my work is concerned here, I want to first and foremost to be a good listener, because I want to listen to the views and concerns of the other side, and so as to understand what their concerns are. And secondly, I want to be a good speaker. And I need, as a Chinese diplomat and ambassador, of course, I need to speak for China. So, and I'm glad that so far I've been having a good audience and good hearing from all walks of life. And also, thirdly, I think that is also important. I want to be a good deal maker. And we both have our own interest to safeguard, and we also both have our own concerns. And so it is important that we listen to each other, we speak our concerns and interests, and but at the end, we need to make things done. That is most important. So I also want to be a good deal maker between the two sides as an ambassador. And so it's a cliche to say that I want to be a bridge. But actually, that is how I see myself. And so there are things that can be done despite our differences, sometimes which appear to be irreconcilable differences. But so long as we continue the dialogue, I'm sure there will be ways that we can find to resolve our differences. That is what I firmly believe. And that is what I see my job is here in Brussels. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Fu, for creating this very compelling, probably universal formula for diplomacy. You said listener, speaker, and deal maker. Secondly, you reminded us of the importance of history, in particular in Europe. And then thirdly, I would like to just thank you for taking the time in your busy day-to-day work to spend your time here in the discussion and for basically responding to all these different questions. So thank you very much for joining this webinar discussion.
Thank you.
I would like to thank everyone who's still online. I see the number has actually not dropped of online participants, so thank you for staying until the end. I apologize for not having been able to take all of the questions, but I think I've weaved in many of the questions. I would like to, at the very closure, just share briefly. Let me see where I can find it. I would like to share a quick recap of our webinar series that we had. So basically what you see, we had 6 discussions in this edition of 2023 of Staying in Dialogue with China. We started with Jörg Wuttke. We went on to Professor Bai Tong'en from Tsinghua. And then we had a discussion on finance with Xing Yujing, formerly with the PBOC in Shenzhen. And then we talked to Ambassador Toledo. We had last time, very recently, Professor Jia from PKU. And then today we had the big pleasure of having Excellency Ambassador Fu Cong in our discussion. So I would like to wish you a very good day and thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much, Ambassador Fu.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.